Hello and welcome to another Wilderness Tamed video. Make sure I've got the sound on here. And in this one, I thought we'd have a look at weeds. Cue intro. I haven't got an intro yet. So, weeds, what are they? What defines a weed? And how do we control them? And why should we, if at all? Okay, so when I had my garden in its sort of formal mode with all exotic plants in it and things from when I was, post horticulturally trained, I couldn't sit and relax in the garden very well. Every time I saw something growing that I didn't want or I didn't think should be there, I was up and out and pulling out and weeding and doing whatever. But now the garden is over and changed to its more sort of like a natural habitat, so using wild native species. I can sit and enjoy it far more and just watch things grow. And if there's what would be classed as weeds in amongst it, doesn't matter. Good on them if they can compete with the dense sort of carpet of sort of native meadow plants, wildflower plants. But in an allotment situation, such as where I am now, I'm in the glass house, but out on the allotment, where you've got crops growing, there are areas you want to keep clear. And also in some of the jobs, some of the gardens I do on a regular basis for my customers, they require a little bit more of a traditional formal garden sort of look to them. And if anything crops up in the beds and borders that doesn't quite fit in with a plan, then it's got to come out. Saying that, there are several what would be classed as garden plants, ornamental garden plants, that I think are weeds and are a little bit too prolific in the way they reproduce. And some, like as far as value for money goes, there is none. And the one that springs to mind immediately is Crocosmia massonorum, commonly called the Montepricia. Grows from these little corms which reproduce in a sort of stack. When you dig them out, you'll often find a sort of a column of little round corms stacked on top of each other. In fact, you can see this one, there's a young one growing at the bottom. And they send up these grassy, there's a clover mixed in with that, these grassy fronds, which aren't entirely unattractive. And then they send up a flower spike in about August time, which produces, these columns of little orange flowers. There's the hybrid one, Lucifer, which is the deep red, bright red flower. There's Emily Mackenzie. There's all kinds of different varieties now, but essentially they all only flower for about 3 weeks, 4 weeks at a push. And to my mind, 4 weeks in a full year isn't a massive amount of flower value. And then they just look like this, and then they start to flop over, and they form a dense mat, and they smother anything underneath them. And to my mind, they're a classic granny plant, put it that way, without being offensive to any grandmothers. But you'll see a lot of these in big clumps, just smothering out all of the plants. And I wouldn't have them, basically. So this one I got from a customer's garden, where I'm gradually getting rid of them, thinning them out. And I'm not even going to put this in the compost because I wouldn't want it growing again. I'll cut the leaves off because they'll not regrow, they'll just decompose. But that corm that goes in the council waste or gets burned with fire because you don't want these taking a foothold in the garden situation. Another one that can go properly over the top if left unchecked. They've gone a bit wilty, if you can recognise the leaves, Aqualesia. Now these have a very tough, almost dandelion-like deep taproot, but they grow, or they tend to proliferate in a garden from seed. So like a lot of things, they're fine when they're in flower. Don't mind an Aqualesia in flower, but whatever you do, if providing you don't want them to go completely berserk in the garden, is remove the seed heads carefully and tip them up into a bin and get rid of them. There's another classic example of that sort of deep taproot. So quite tough to dig out. I seem to have several examples. That's a slightly better one. Hasn't wilted so much, so the leaves are those trifoliate leaves. Yeah, a little bit on the invasive side. What's that? Actual weeds. Oh, here's another one that's considered a garden plant. It's your little Welsh poppy, Mechanopsis cambrica. This yellow poppy again, seeds like mad. Quite an attractive flower. Has its uses with pollinators. Oh, there's a seed pod. And they form a little sort of rosette. Again, these have gone a bit wilty. They were dug out from a garden last Thursday, and today is Tuesday of the following week. So, yeah, little sort of rosette of leaves. Again, a deep taproot, so they're a bit of a beggar to dig out. In fact, there's one with a classic single taproot, like a parsnip. Don't know if they're edible or not. Don't try that. But again, the kind of thing that as soon as it's finished flowering, ideally, you want to remove the seed head and dispose of it. Same goes for buddleia. In fact, I'm sure the RHS now recommend that you do not let buddleias go to seed because they're classed as sort of a highly invasive plant, and they can take over an area. If you've ever taken a train journey anywhere, you'll know that you pretty much know when you're coming into a city because the train lines are swamped in buddleia. So there are a couple of examples of actual garden plants, sort of semi-ornate garden plants that can get a little bit out of hand if you don't keep a check on them. Now another one, let's get onto the actual weeds here. This one you'll have seen, small pink flowers, forms a little rosette. In fact, there's a little tiny bud of a pink flower coming up there. Grows from a rosette of glossy green leaves, but very easy, very fine fibrous roots. Grows in a clump, very easy to dig out. They're very shallow roots, and in fact this one just pulled out. So an easy one to hand weed, but and again the seed, you can see all these thin grey or straw coloured open seed pods. They just kind of burst open and seeds, little fluffy seeds, drift off and scatter about. So it's willow herb family, so you'll all be familiar with rosebay willow herb. Grows along the roadsides and riverbanks. and the seeds drift off for miles, so a very prolific spreader. But pretty much an ephemeral weed, which means that they will germinate, grow, flower, produce seed continually at any time of year. So even during the winter, they will be actively growing. They'll germinate and grow and send up stalks and stuff. Is this the only example of this one? Oh no. So another one, which is a very prolific weed, but it's related to a lovely plant, the water ravens, Geum rivali, but this is Geum arvensis, the wood avens. So a dense clump of fibrous roots, not too deep, so fairly easy to dig out, a rosette of leaves, these classic Geum leaves. The garden variety is Geum, is it Mrs. Bradshaw, and there's another few. And then this sends up this, so there's the roots, the leaves, and then these thin stalks, leaves all the way up, and then little, quite small yellow flowers, just open buttercuppy type flowers. They get a little fuzzy seed pod, and that's the kind of seeds that latches onto clothing and animal fur and gets transported around that way. But again, very, very prolific. Germination rate is quite alarming. Your classic stinging nettle. So it will grow from seed. It likes a nutrient-rich soil. I think one of the old classic survival techniques is if you're lost out in the moors and you come across a clump of nettles, you know you're next to civilization, because they'll grow where cattle pee and poo regularly in the corners of fields or under trees. If you see a lot of nettles growing under a tree, that's a shelter tree for sheep or cows or horses, so the ground's very nutrient rich. So you know you're getting close to civilization when you see a lot of nettles. Makes great tea, full of lots of benefits. Nettle soup and nettle tea, I can highly recommend. But this is how they spread. Long fibrous roots and new shoots. You can see this little pink shoots that they're sending up. That's all new growth. So they'll form a shallow mat of roots under the soil, so you can prise under them with a fork and lever them up and get rid of them that way. But they can really take over an area, and because they're quite tall growing, they can swamp out a lot of other stuff. So whilst they're great as a food supply for several butterfly species, so peacocks, red admirals, tortoiseshells, I think commas as well, all lay their eggs on nettles, which is what their caterpillars then feed on, and then you'll get a lovely show of butterflies. So don't completely annihilate nettles, but just keep them in check. I mean, I've got a few patches of nettles in the garden. Doesn't worry me at all. Everyone's arch nemesis, especially if you're fond of your lawn, le dandelion, the lion's tooth, dandelion, Taraxacum officinale. I don't think I need to have a flower on this one for you to know what it is. And the infamous taproot. But if you hunt around on YouTube, and in fact I might put a link in the editing process to other videos where they talk about the benefits of dandelions, especially in a vegetable growing situation where that deep taproot is punching through the soil, aerating the soil and bringing up loads of nutrients and minerals to the soil surface where other plants, such as your vegetables, can make use of them. So I tend not to try and completely get rid of, excuse me, I'm just putting some onion skin in the bin, of dandelions because they are useful, and the leaves washed and put in a salad, and the flowers as well in a salad, brilliant. So try and kind of pull the reins back a bit on your annihilation of dandelions, because they do have a lot of uses, as you'll see from other videos. Again, arch nemesis of many a gardener, couch grass, however you want to pronounce it. I think they call it twitch down under. It can be a nightmare. Look at those roots. They will spread and spread and spread and send up new growth constantly. You can try digging them out. The problem is the roots go quite deep, and they're very fibrous and brittle, so if a bit of these roots drop off, I mean, let's give you an example. I have to get the knife and cut a bit. Damn, this is tough. That left in the soil is enough to regrow, regenerate and produce more of this stuff. I mean, it's probably in most people's lawns, but because their lawns are getting mown regularly, they're not noticing it. But it loves waste ground, regularly cultivated ground. It will just spring up and spread like mad. So the kindest way to try and get rid of it is, and it's what I use on the allotment, is just mulch mats. So I have, obviously from all the pond jobs that I do, I end up with an excess of pond liner and pond underlay. So it's that thick black felt stuff. And I just spread that about. I have big square offcuts of pond liner, put down on areas that I'm not planting into and not using, so to prevent the weeds, seeds settling on the soil or any perennial weed roots in the soil sending stuff up. They'll come up, they'll grow, but they'll sit under the blackness, be choked out of light, and eventually die. They'll just lose energy from the roots and die, providing you leave the mulch on long enough. But the only other way, other than physically digging it out, but that's got to be like painting the fourth bridge, you'll be on with it forever, is a systemic herbicide. Because you want something that attacks the leaves, is absorbed into the plant, and goes down into the root system and kills the roots as well. Because if you just kill the top off with a contact spray, or everybody harps on about using vinegar and detergent with salt as an organic alternative, except you've got to bear in mind that vinegar is an acid and it's killing all your soil organisms. So I'm not sure how organic that is. It's a systemic herbicide that you want. And we're a bit limited, unfortunately, into what is available on the market at the moment. I'm not going to mention it, but you all know what I'm talking about. So yeah, if you're determined to get rid of some of these very pernicious weeds, especially the spready root types, ground elder is another classic type, mare's tail, equisetum, if you've got that in your garden, I would just sell it and move. They're all very, very difficult to get rid of. So, I'm a bit close in there, aren't I? So, yeah, either put a hot black mulch down, like a pond liner type black plastic or something, and leave it there for a long time in order to just starve out any pernicious perennial plants. Annual stuff and ephemeral stuff, not so bad. You could hoe some of those weeds out. some of the ones I've mentioned, like the willow herb, some of the little spurges, speedwells, senecio, or whatever you want to call them, shepherd's purse and chickweeds and things like that. You can hoe them out, bundle them up, put them in a compost bag or get rid of them. But the thing with hoeing the ground is you're disturbing the soil. And in doing so, you're bringing seeds up to the surface. I'm going to swap hands because I'm getting tired. You're bringing weeds up to the surface, and the sunlight will encourage them to germinate. And then you're back to square one. Within no time at all, the area you've just cleared with the hoe is full of weeds again. I often say that a gardener who comes and hoes your beds and borders for you is essentially keeping himself in work, because he'll know, or perhaps he doesn't know, that disturbing the soil helps the weeds germinate. And just slicing the rosettes of leaves off the tops of perennial stuff like the geum that I showed you, and the couch grass and the nettles and thistles and things, you're leaving the roots in, they're just going to grow again. So hoeing is possibly not the best way to deal with weeds. Physically digging them out, like turning the borders, turning the beds. Again, any gardener who offers to, oh, come and turn your beds for your missus, he knows he's going to be back there in another couple of weeks doing exactly the same. You've got to be very meticulous in making sure that you've dug out all of the perennial roots, which again with couch grass and dandelions, there's always going to be a little bit left in, which is going to regrow. There's a creeping senecio as well that we have on the allotment here, which is a nightmare to get rid of, absolute nightmare. So yeah, very difficult to deal with. And don't be fooled by mulches of wood chips, gravel, straw, leaves, compost, or whatever you want to do. A deep layer of mulch is not going to stop weeds growing. They will grow through it. I mean, come on, we've all seen them growing through cracks in concrete, lifting paving slabs. Wood chips on top of a landscape fabric, or gravel on top of landscape fabric. I've mentioned this in social media posts and maybe other videos before, but if you put gravel on a path or a driveway or a bed, it's the perfect place for weed seeds to germinate. Believe me, damp gravel and damp wood chips, seeds love that, absolutely love it. So I wouldn't bother. Wood chips on beds and borders with landscape fabric underneath, absolute bloody nightmare to deal with. Sorry for my profanities there, but just a waste of time. As a gardener I used to manage, up until recently I've passed it on to a friend of mine, and the previous occupants had put landscape fabric down and then mulched with wood chips. Wherever there was a gap in the fabric, where there was a tear or a circle that they'd cut for a shrub to be planted into, weeds were growing out through it. And trying to get into it to get those weeds out, nightmare. The birds love scattering wood chips about. Blackbirds are an absolute nightmare. They will scrat through wood chips, kicking them about all over your lawn, your paths, your driveways. So just don't. As I mentioned in one of the early gardening videos about beds and borders, just plant them up densely. Just invest in loads and loads of plants and plant them up so there's no space for weeds, and then your problem is solved. Nature loves a void. If you've got bare soil in your garden, nature will want to fill it with weeds and moss and liverworts and all the stuff you probably don't want. Okay, so if you don't want to be hoeing and digging weeds up all the time, don't have soil, bare soil. I actually had somebody that I went to visit in a garden recently saying, oh no, we don't want the borders full, it's too much work. We like to see soil. They like to see soil. Who likes to see soil? I don't. It's just, that was nonsense to me. So I essentially walked away and didn't offer to maintain their garden. Because they're obviously idiots. And yes, they may see this, but whatever. At least they'll know that they're doing it wrong. Wow, harsh. Okay, so that's weeds and how to deal with them. Hope you've learned something from that. Some weeds can be useful. Again, oh yeah, the definition of a weed. I mentioned that at the beginning. The definition of a weed is any plant that is growing where you don't want it. Doesn't mean it's a native thing that seeds and breeds everywhere like rabbits. It's just any plant growing where you don't want it. So in the case of my garden, any rose would be a weed. I do not like roses. In my garden, a peony rose, absolute nightmare. What a waste of a plant. 3 weeks of flower, and then the next 8 months of really ugly leaves. No thanks. A cabbage in a rose bed would be a weed, unless you wanted your roses underplanting with cabbages. So yeah, it can be anything, absolutely anything. It doesn't have to be one of these pernicious things that I've shown you in this video. It can be any plant, any ornamental plant growing in the wrong place is a weed. Okay, so and before I remove anything from a garden, I think, is it actually of benefit? So there's a garden I look after, and there's one area where I've left the herb Robert, Geranium robertianum. It's that little feathery leafed thing with the tiny little pink flowers with the stripes through them. It forms a mat of ground cover full of flowers, loved by hoverflies and bees. So why would I dig that up? It's doing what it should do. It's growing under a tree in dry shade, which is a tricky thing to find a plant to do. It's attractive and it's serving a purpose. It's feeding pollinating insects, and hoverflies are predatory insects as well. So why would I get rid of that? It's in a quiet little corner of the garden, doing no harm, and in fact serving a purpose. So again, think about, it's like I'm trying to change your brains here. Think about what use a plant can be, not just of benefit to you as a gardener, like has it got big Balarzi flowers or variegated leaves or whatever it is that you like, but is it serving a purpose? Is it actually doing any harm in the garden? And if not, what good is it doing? And if it's providing a food source for native insects, butterflies, and moths, and bees, which are all in trouble, nationally and internationally, then actually, let's not get rid of it. Let's leave it be. And on that note, I'll bid you all farewell. Happy gardening.